Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Tom Lyle. He's a professor of sequential art at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Tom, welcome to Comic Culture.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, Terrence.
So, sequential art, for those who are not familiar with the term, how would you define that for the layman?
Here at SCAD, we define it kind of broadly in the sense that anything that deals with images in sequence. And so it can cover children's books, storyboarding, conceptual illustration, and in my case, mainly comic books.
Okay, and how did you get into teaching? Because your career before you were a professor, you were a successful penciler.
Well, Marvel and DC both had issues after the boom of the 90s when the sales were quite robust, but a lot of it was false sales because people were buying multiple copies of issues expecting them to be worth lots of money, and then they disappeared overnight. But towards the end of the 90s, my salary was making me untenable to the companies. And so around 2001, my career hit a giant wall. And I had to start trying to reinvent myself because I tried for 3 years to break back into the industry full time and couldn't make it happen. So I started looking at options and discovered SCAD and applied here in 2004 and got hired in 2005. And I've been here for 10 years now. I'm in my 11th year.
So it's interesting. A successful artist, somebody whose books sell well, could be in a position where he's making too much money. It's sort of like on television, the cast of Friends could probably have done another 3 or 4 years, but because the cast was each making $1 million an episode or so, it's just unprofitable for NBC at that point. And it's interesting to hear that a company like Marvel or DC would say, well, you know what, we can get somebody else who might do half the numbers and pay a lot less.
You know, not meaning to in any way sound bitter, because I'm not, but it's they're always looking for the younger, hotter, new thing that they can pay less.
Well, now you're in the position of helping the younger, hotter, new thing refine their skills and get to the point where they are making a contribution to the world of comics. So in your role as a professor of sequential art, what are some of the topics that you touch on that a student is going to learn beyond, let's say, perspective or figure drawing?
Well, my specialties that I teach here are 3 particular classes that I teach over and over again, and then a 4th one that's taught once a year. I do teach drawing for sequential art, where I do cover anatomy, perspective, and environments and stuff like that, which is really important for them. And then I teach the visual storytelling 1 and visual storytelling 2, which is my love. I can talk about storytelling till I'm blue in the face. And then once a year, we offer a class called Superhero Comics for those that want to try and work on the dynamics and the storytelling chops that you need to break into that industry. So but that's just my part. There are 10 full-time professors here. So they're all have their specialties because we teach like cartooning, digital coloring, script writing, that kind of stuff.
So you mentioned that there's a superhero-specific course. So
yes.
In the terms, I guess, from the perspective of an artist, is there a different approach to storytelling when you're looking at, let's say, a Love and Rockets or a Batman that's going to be a different way that you're telling that story?
There used to be more of a difference, but now the comic books, superhero comics have become so decompressed story-wise now that the storylines last for so much longer now than they used to, and especially than they used to in the 60s when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were doing their thing. I mean, just to make an example, I think the Galactic Silver Surfer story that lasted 2 issues in Fantastic Four would last 24 issues now, if they did it. But for the superhero comics, I have to work on their dynamics and get them to think about when a figure moves, everything's moving, like their chest turns, their head turns, their arms are doing things, so that there's a nice, almost graceful ballet to the way it is. And then fight choreography is hard. And that's one of the things I try and teach is how to choreograph a fight. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're working from scripts from real Marvel and DC books.
So fight choreography, is this something where it's, you look at photo reference or you encourage that, or is this something where you just sort of say what looks the most dynamic in this shot and gives the most power to a punch or something?
It is actually what gives the most power to the punch. I mean, I bought How to Draw the Marvel Way when it first came out 1 million years ago, and they talked about you don't want to catch a punch here, you want it either all the way through or just getting started way back here. so that you get the most oomph to it. But the storytelling now has become a lot softer because there's more people standing around talking. So I work on their acting skills too, the way they look at people. And but yeah, it's a matter of the dynamics. And I always loved Todd McFarlane, the way he talked about when he drew Spider-Man. He said he always tried to draw Spider-Man where every joint of his body was going in a different direction. And it wasn't always right, but his enthusiasm made it look cool.
Well, that's true. When you see an artist like Todd McFarlane or Jack Kirby or John Buscema, who drawing comics the Marvel way, that was a Christmas gift my sister gave me, and my copy is falling apart. But when I sit down at the drawing table, I what am I doing wrong? And I'll kind of refer to that, like you were saying, where the punch goes and how to extend that line and everything. So you're saying that the craft of comics, or I guess the business of comics, is making more for these long-form stories. They seem to be kind of collected for the trades, it seems to me that, like you're saying, there's more acting going on and less car chases, so to speak, if we were using the movie parlance. So how do you balance that? You said acting. How do you balance those scenes with the action scene? Is there a formula that you try and follow that you so many pages of this followed by so many pages of that, or is it just how the story dictates?
Well, the artists right now have a lot less say over how the story paces out than when I was doing, because I got the pleasure, even with Starman, which was a DC book, and DC wasn't big on working this way, except with certain people, but I've always worked best when I got to work what they call Marvel style, where I worked from a plot, and I could decide how many pages something took, and then they wrote the script and dialogue and narration after I drew it. But most of the stuff now is done with a full script handed to you that paces the story out for you. So the best you can hope to do is to make it as exciting as possible within the confines of what the writer has given you, because you're not allowed to add panels and you're not supposed to take panels away.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about the DC method. If you take a look at some of the older Superman books written by Kurt Swan, drawn by Kurt Swan, pardon me, it always seemed that his storytelling wasn't as dynamic as, let's say, a Jack Kirby, and that could be because Marvel would give Jack Kirby a loose outline. A giant comes from space and he's going to eat the world. Go. And it always seemed that Kurt Swan was more of, and then Lois is going to have lunch, and this is the waiter brings the menu over, and it didn't quite have that same power and drama. Now, when you look at today's comic artists, is there one artist who kind of balances between, and I know you don't want to, name names or play favorites or whatnot. Okay. Is there an artist who sort of balances the old dynamics and the contemporary storytelling methods?
There's quite a few. It depends on what they're working on. I still love Chris Bachalo's work. He's doing the Doctor Strange book right now that just came out. And Stuart Eminem, I find him extremely readable. And he's actually reinvented himself a couple of times. Romita Jr. is still doing good work, but he's become so popular that he's being spoiled by his popularity, and his work isn't quite as dynamic as it used to be. And I have to admit, this industry can spoil you. I mean, it can really, you start, yeah, I'll go spend this money instead of working today.
It's interesting because there are, over the course of, I guess, my time of reading comics, there have been superstar artists who kind of come and go. And there are some that just managed to, for some reason, guys like Romita Jr. or Dan Jurgens, who just managed to have careers that last nonstop for 30 years or so, right, with consistent work. But then you have the guys who, like J. Scott Campbell, who was really big in the early 2000s, but you don't hear much about him now. And it's I guess, speaks to the industry and the fickle nature of the consumer, or is it also, like you were referring to, that sometimes you get a little too big for the industry?
It might be partly that you could get too big for the industry. I think to a certain extent it's just that in their crush to find sales that are higher than they are now, because I will tell you, Marvel and DC are doing okay, but just to give you an example of how different sales are, since I was commenting on the New Gods poster behind you, Jack Kirby was lured away from Marvel in 1970 to do the Fourth World stuff. And after 18 months, they canceled all 4 of his books because the sales were so abysmal for them. And if you read the sales figures in the books, those abysmal figures were 900,000 copies an issue. And And I'm like, holy Toledo. And the average Marvel DC book sells about 25 to 50,000 copies right now, which is not anything close to that. So I know I have to admit the $4 and $5 price tag makes a big difference too. Because my mother thought I was wasting my money, but spending 12 cents a piece on comics.
Well, it's true. I go to Comic Cons, and that's where we met at the Heroes Con in Charlotte. I like to go through the long boxes, and if you find a comic from, 1974, let's say, you actually spend a longer time reading the book than you do if you were to pick up the latest issue of, Justice League that's being printed presently. And I don't know if it's because they were just figuring more value for the money, or if it's just because we've sort of gotten accustomed to visuals.
I think, no, it's because of the stories being stretched out. There's less dialogue to read, there's less narration to read, because they're trying to cover less territory, so you don't have as cramped a page to have to deal with. So the visuals and the dialogue read much faster now than they used to. My students in my superhero class that I'm teaching right now, I'm making them read a bunch of Lee and Kirby stuff and Ditko and things like that. And they're like, holy Toledo, there's so much dialogue here. And I'm like, but think about it. They assumed that back then they would assume that the readers were casual readers, so that they had to do stories that were short in case you missed something. So they try and do one-issue stories so that they can have casual readers. The majority of comic book readers now are long-range readers. There's fewer of them, but they buy more consistently. So they can do stories that are stretched out and that go through 8 million books with like these events that they have. And no offense, I find that bothersome, but it still seems to work. The fans buy more books when they do crossovers and big events, and I don't understand it. But I will say trade paperbacks are what's keeping the industry afloat right now.
Well, it is true. I mean, with a trade paperback, you can just pick up one book and you have every issue of that particular story, and it's a satisfying read. But like you were saying, the big events seem to have lost the big and the event part of it. They've just become these long tangled stories that you have to buy all of these different connected parts, and it's almost like a pyramid scheme.
Well, just to tell you, one of the hardest parts of writing comic books and doing storytelling for comics is that you have to give the impression that something bad could happen to these people, but it's a monthly comic that has this person's name on it, so they can't die. And that impression is hard to give, that something can happen, because the readers know, well, this guy will be here next month. So it's really tough. So they're bringing out every bag of tricks they can, like changing characters, changing Thor into a female and stuff like that. Or, a different character who is female. Changing Captain America and having an African-American Captain America and stuff like that. They're trying stunts now for sales, and it's a drag to me, because sometimes some of the stunts seem very salacious, in the sense that I think they're trying too darn hard when they should just be writing good stories. But the craft of storytelling for comics is really hard to give the impression that something can happen, which is why, I'm responsible for being part of the clone story on Spider-Man. We were genuinely trying to do something that was going to be permanent. Unfortunately, it got up and it did not end the way it was supposed to, because in the original thing with the clone story, Ben Reilly was supposed to be the real Peter Parker. And the reason we were doing that is because the whole thing of being Spider-Man is that being Peter Parker is supposed to suck, and being Spider-Man is supposed to be a respite from being Peter Parker. And when you're married to Mary Jane Watson, living in a penthouse, and I don't know what else, life ain't bad as Peter Parker. So we were trying to bust that up a little bit.
So let's touch base on your career a little bit.
Okay.
You've worked on some really stellar books. Like you were saying, you were part of the Spider-Man clone saga. You were also the artist of the Red Hot Robin miniseries. And you were also the co-creator of the early 90s Starman. So how do things like that sort of come across your doorstep? Obviously, you need to do the work to get your foot in the door, but how do you get those jobs, and how do you hold on to them?
I'm the hilarious example of somebody who is rarely pursued, but I'm so doggedly persistent, I get stuff. I had been doing I'll start with Starman first, and then hit Robin, and then hit Spider-Man. In the case of Starman, I had been working at Eclipse Comics for about 1.5 years, and Chuck Dixon and I were doing a book called Strike. and strike got put on what they called hiatus, and Chuck Dixon and I called canceled. Uh, and so I needed work. And I had been going into New York every month. Eclipse is out in California, by the way, but I've been going to New York and still showing my work to Marvel and DC every month, just to stay current, because, of course, the big two are always my big, dream. And this particular month, after I found my book was going on hiatus, I always met Robert Greenberger, who was an editor then at DC, early, because he got in early and he liked meeting me, and it was nice. And so I'd go to him like at 9 o'clock in the morning, and most of the other editors didn't show up at 10. And it was hilarious. The day I got Starman, it was funny because he was looking at my art and he was saying the same things he'd been saying for 3 years. I was like, you're kind of doing this wrong. This isn't bad. You're kind of doing this wrong. And he's flipping through my pages and he's like, yeah, sort of. Yeah, you should be working for us. and I went, well, twist my arm. But I thought it was going to be like every other day. But I will tell you, behind the scenes, I had been courting Roger Stern through snail mail, and Roger was the main impetus behind Starman and the Power of the Atom book that started at the same time. He wrote both of those. And I don't know, I've never actually asked Roger if he had any say in whether or not they were interested in me or not, but I've been writing him and trying to talk to him, and but I am one persistent sucker. So I got that book and wrote it for 2 years. I did 25 issues with Roger, and it was fun.
So a book like that, you said that was a script that was done more the Marvel style.
Yes.
And when you look at the artwork now from issue 1 to issue 25.
I can't believe I got hired.
Well, do you see a progression? I dabble. I go home and I try and do a couple of pages a month of a graphic novel that I've been working on. And I can look at the first couple of pages and say, wow, I was really awful. And then I see some spots where I seem to hit a few marks. And then towards the end, you always hope that you're going to be happier with the stuff you're working on. So when you look at a book that you had over 2 years on and 20 some odd pages every month, when you look at your art, do you see that moment where you kind of connected and all the dots started to come together?
It was so slow and incremental, I didn't see it that way. It wasn't like all of a sudden, lights went off and stuff like that. But I do, when I look at issue 1 and I look at issue 25, I'm like, there's 600 and some odd pages in there. And you can't help by sheer volume but get better if you're looking at your work with any kind of a critical eye by having done that much volume. And also, I will credit the people I worked with, in the sense that, like, Bob Smith was my inker for about half my run on Starman, and then Scott Hanna came on about halfway through, and he was my inker for half the way. I had a really good relationship with both of them. They would both say, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. And I'd listen, and then I'd tell them, well, here's what I'm trying to do. And they go, oh, I see what you're doing, and they'd make it work. But Scott was really funny, because where the top of the diaphragm is here, I used to draw it down lower, and he's like, it's up here. And he kept telling me to bring it up and stuff like that. And then I have a couple of affectations that I do that are intentional but not correct. And he picked up on them and knew what I was doing. But it was neat. And as an inker, he knew some textures that he taught me. So that was really cool. So it's a really good symbiotic relationship when you're working with somebody else sometimes. And I credit that for my growth as well. I've had very few aha moments like I used to have back then lately, where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I never saw it like that. But perspective, I got much better at as I went along, and I'm really happy about that. So, but I like just the sheer volume of how many issues I did helped me get better.
So it's interesting to hear that. I guess in the days before email and text messages, that you were able to get feedback from your collaborators who were telling you different tips and points and sort of working as a team to make the book better. That's, sometimes you hear about some inkers who were known, I won't name names, who would just, erase things in the background because I don't have time to do all that detail work. I'm just going to do the figures and it'll be more abstract that way.
Somebody used to ink Thor over Jack Kirby.
Yes. So it's nice to hear that there's that sort of esprit de corps, I guess. We're all working together to make this better, and that it comes back to you in a positive way.
And it was neat. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the phone talking to these guys too, and that was really helpful. And it was funny because when I was on Spider-Man, Scott Hanna was my inker as well on that. And Scott actually talked to the colorists, and we were trying to get everybody on the same page with what we were trying to do, because we were trying some lighting techniques that we were stealing from Jim Lee a little bit with the underlighting Jim was doing and stuff like that. And the colorist wasn't picking up on it enough. And plus, I stole from Steve Ditko, as I always do Spider-Man with kind of a halo on the outside of it, because in a Doctor Strange Spider-Man annual, there was this really cool yellow halo he did on the outside of Spider-Man. And I stole that from Steve Ditko, and I just like, I love that. I've got to do it. So very few of the colorists knew how to handle it. So Scott was great about talking about that. So it's really neat. I mean, I do like the collaborative nature of this industry and the way the job goes.
Well, it's interesting too that you know, you were sort of at an interesting point in the industry where they were changing paper to, I guess, a glossier stock where they could do more with the color and be a lot more expressive. And I guess it's an interesting point now when we see we're switching over to that digital medium where you can do even more.
Yeah.
So when we get back to Robin, I guess after Starman, you...
Robin's a really interesting... Let me interrupt you. I'm going to tell you the Robin story real quick. I actually, when I left Starman, I was supposed to be doing the Comet for Impact Comics, which was a DC subprint. And I had a 2-month gap between the end of Starman and the beginning of the Comet. And being the brassy person that I am, I thought, I could draw Batman for a month or two. And so I called out the Batman office, and Denny O'Neil was the editor, and Dan Rassler was his assistant at the time. And Denny is very reclusive, so he rarely talks directly to the freelancers, except maybe the writers. And so Dan Rassler picked up the phone and was talking to me, and I asked Dan, do you have an issue or two of Batman I could draw? And Dan just went, nah, but we got this mini-series we're about to do. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, I can't tell you until you tell me you'll do it. And so we played a guessing game, and I said, well, is it something really dumb like Alfred? And he's like, oh, no, it's not that bad. And you know, so I said, is it like Commissioner Gordon? He said, oh, no, it's better now. And I said, well, it's got to be Robin then. So sure, I'll do it. And he said, yeah, it's Robin. But I just got that purely by luck of calling it at the right time. And to be honest, neither Chuck nor I would have gotten that gig if they had thought it would sell like it was, like it did, because they would have given it to a big name. So I feel lucky that my timing was so perfect. And to everybody, persistence, timing is everything, and networking. I mean, it's just imperative that you can do those things. But I feel real lucky. And then they asked me if I knew anybody as a writer who knew about martial arts. And Chuck and I had talked martial arts a ton, so I recommended Chuck, and we got on that book together. And just to tell you, one of the coolest things we did with Robin is neither of us thought of him as the sidekick boy wonder. He's just Robin, a cool character. And I think people picked up on that and liked that.
Well, to this day, if you talk to Bat fans, they will tell you that Tim Drake is the best Robin because he was the most fully formed. And not only was he the sidekick, but he was more of a partner. Whereas it took Dick Grayson becoming Nightwing to really kind of stand out on his own, and nobody really cared about Jason Todd, or else they wouldn't have called that 800 number.
Yes, I know.
So you managed to have a character that was not as redundant as, let's say, Jason Todd, and DC was looking for a different approach, and you kind of were able to work that together. And Chuck Dixon would go on to have a really celebrated run on Batman, the signature book, for a number of years as well. So when Robin is a big hit, now you become the household name. How does that impact you as the artist?
How did it impact me? My salary went up. That was good. It's one of those things, like I was talking about earlier, that this industry can spoil you. So I kept having all these people tell me how good I was, and it was fun, and it was great. But I will tell you, Mike Carlin was an editor on the Superman books for years and years and years, and then he was editor-in-chief at DC for a while. Mike gave me the best backhand compliment that kept me in line that I've ever had. Is I saw him in the offices at DC once after the first miniseries had come out, and he was the editor of the Atom book that Roger Stern did, and I was actually kind of gearing towards that one instead of Starman, but I got Starman instead. And Mike just yelled down the hall. He said, "Hey, Lyle," and I went, "Yeah," and he said, "Robin looks pretty good. I didn't think you had it in you. Congratulations." And then he said, "I probably should have hired you for the Atom book," and I went, "Yes, you should have."
That's, you know, it is interesting when you have, I guess, a career where you can go back, and you're naming names that I'm thinking back to, you know, books that I've read that I've seen them in there, and it brings me back to a time when I was reading comics a lot more, I guess, intently than I am now. And the Robin book is one that I remember it coming out, and it was one of the first books that had the gimmicky covers, I believe.
Yes.
So when you have a book that is, I guess, has a solid story and it has the gimmick cover, how does that sort of make I guess, the legacy of the book? How does that impact it from your point of view?
From my point of view, I always just encourage the fans to just buy the newsstand book and not spend the extra money for the spiffy covers. But, they actually enjoyed doing that. And, I never held a gun to their head and made them buy all 3 of the types of covers they had for each issue or whatever. It sort of troubles me but I thank each and every one of them, and I never charge for signatures. So, because if they bought the book and enjoyed it, that's cool. I mean, from the standpoint of the creator, it's hard for me to get back into that fan mentality I used to have. And so I view it from the point of one book, I can read that, and that's cool.
Well, I've been told we have just a couple of minutes left in our conversation.
Oh, okay.
And I was just wondering if you could give some tips to maybe some aspiring artists out there, maybe looking to go to a college to study sequential art. What can they do to get themselves ready?
There's a lot of good books on storytelling now. Carl Potts just came out with one on visual storytelling. Scott McCloud's Understanding and Making Comics books are quite good. And then one of the things I actually, when I was in college, since I'm completely self-taught, I bought a book on film directing and started watching movies and how they did storytelling. Because the thing that a lot of artists don't understand is about eyeline, how characters should be looking at each other and that kind of stuff. And it's really important to know about that. And so I really, really emphasize eyeline. But study more than just other comic books. You got to study every medium. And by the way, to break into this industry, you got to have an internet presence now. So you got to have some sort of a website with your artwork available on it. I mean, because they are out there looking at you. Believe it or not, the editors are out there looking at you.
And is that something that that you go over in your work, where you kind of give students that social marketing primer?
We actually have a class called self-promotion here. You create a digital portfolio, get it online, create your own business card, that kind of stuff, and make sure that you're available so that when you do start sending your stuff around, they'll be able to find it easily.
And are you encouraging students to learn both the traditional pencil on paper method and the digital methods?
Yes, we're doing both right now, and a lot of people much prefer the digital, and a lot of people prefer the traditional, and it's their choice at this point, because the only thing that they need to know for sure is how to send stuff through the internet, because it's so amazing. When I was doing stuff, everything was FedExed everywhere, and now nothing ever leaves the artist's house. It's just scanned and sent via the internet, and that's so amazing. So you can live anywhere in the world and work in this industry.
Well, I'm being told we need to wrap up. Tom, I want to thank you for spending time with us today, and I'd like to thank our audience for watching. We've been talking to Tom Lyle, and you've been watching Comic Culture. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.